What if I told you that in the remote wilderness of Siberia, 7 teenagers were brutally murdered by the very people who were supposed to protect them? What if I told you that this chilling case was covered up for years, with witnesses dying under mysterious circumstances? And what if I told you that some of the killers walked free, returning to positions of power? This is the disturbing mystery of the Kazanet 7, a case so horrific that it changed an entire nation's understanding of corruption and evil. Welcome to Unseen Casebook Vids, where we dive deep into the cases that refuse to stay buried. If you're ready to uncover the truth behind one of Russia's most disturbing cases, hit that like button and subscribe for more chilling mysteries that will keep you awake at night. There are places on this earth where darkness pools like stagnant water, where the very air seems to whisper of things that should never have happened. Kazanet is one of those places. It's not even a village, really. Just a handful of rotting wooden houses scattered along a stretch of railway that cuts through the Siberian wilderness like an infected wound. 24 souls call this God-forsaken place home. Though after what happened here, you might question whether they still qualify as souls at all. The trees press in from all sides, endless ranks of pine and birch that seem to watch with hollow, patient eyes. In August, when most of the world basks in summer warmth, Kazanet shivers. The cold here isn't just temperature. It's something deeper. Something malevolent that seeps into your bones and whispers that you are not welcome. On the night of August 14th, 1989, that darkness would claim 7 young lives in a way so horrific that it would haunt everyone who touched the case for decades. But the true horror isn't just what happened to those boys. It's how easily evil can masquerade as authority, and how the innocent can be ground to nothing beneath the wheels of corruption. At 1:40 a.m., freight train number 2008 thundered through the endless night toward Kazanet Station. 70 cars long, a mechanical leviathan hauling its cargo through a wilderness that seemed to hunger for more than just cedar and pine. At the helm sat brothers Vadim and Igor Supronenko, seasoned railwaymen who'd navigated these tracks countless times before. But tonight, the familiar would become alien. As the locomotive's headlights carved through the suffocating darkness ahead, the brothers spotted something that made their blood turn to ice. At first, it was just an irregular shadow sprawled across the rails. Something that shouldn't exist in their ordered world of steel and schedule. Vadim's hand moved to the horn, the sound cutting through the forest like the scream of a dying god. Igor slammed the emergency brakes with the desperation of a man trying to stop time itself. But physics is merciless. A fully loaded freight train doesn't simply stop. The brothers could only watch as their machine carried them forward, until they felt that sickening crunch beneath their wheels, the sound of something breaking that should never break. When the train finally shuddered to a halt, both men sat in stunned silence. Then, with hands that trembled like autumn leaves, they grabbed their lanterns and stepped down into an August night that had suddenly turned Arctic. What they found would brand itself into their souls forever. Scattered across the rails were the torn remnants of 7 human beings, but these weren't the random remains of an accident. These bodies had been arranged, positioned with careful precision, as if someone had taken great care to ensure each broken form lay exactly where the train would guarantee complete obliteration. The Supronenko brothers stood over this theater of death and realized they weren't just witnesses to a tragedy. They were unwilling actors in someone else's carefully orchestrated nightmare. Within hours, police from Abakan descended on Kazanet like carrion birds. Floodlights bathed the scene in harsh illumination that somehow made the darkness beyond seem deeper, more alive. Villagers emerged from their homes with hollow eyes and mumbled denials, claiming they'd slept through everything. Soon, identities emerged from the carnage. 7 names that would become a litany of loss: Dmitri, Nikolai, Vadim, Oleg, Vyacheslav, Roman, and Victor. All 15 years old, all from Mezhdurchensk, all friends who'd ventured into the wilderness for what should have been a simple weekend trip, collecting cedar cones. 7 backpacks were found lined up like tombstones, 250 meters from the tracks. Too neat, too deliberate to be anything but intentional. They stood in perfect formation, as if bearing silent witness to some unspeakable ritual. The official story came swiftly, delivered with the cold efficiency of a bureaucratic machine that wanted this nightmare buried as quickly as possible. The boys had missed their return train, investigators claimed. Exhausted and disoriented, they'd made the fatal decision to rest on the railway tracks. A tragic accident. Nothing more. Case closed, but the families knew better. These weren't reckless children stumbling blindly through the wilderness. They were experienced outdoorsmen who knew the forest like their own backyards. They were well-fed, healthy, clear-headed. The toxicology reports confirmed no alcohol or drugs had clouded their judgment. The idea that all 7 would simultaneously decide to nap on active railway tracks wasn't just implausible, it was obscene. How had none of them moved when the train approached? The Supernenko brothers' testimony haunted everyone who heard it. The boys weren't walking the tracks when the train hit them. They were lying motionless, arranged like offerings to some hungry god. For 2 years, the families fought against a wall of indifference that seemed to stretch to the very heart of the Soviet system. Phone calls went unanswered. Documents mysteriously vanished. Officials slammed doors in their faces with casual cruelty. It was clear that someone wanted this story buried deeper than the boys themselves. But grief is a powerful force. In the fall of 1991, the families penned a desperate letter directly to Russian President Boris Yeltsin, begging him to reopen the investigation. It was a desperate gambit in a country collapsing into chaos. The chances of the letter even being read were virtually non-existent. But sometimes, the impossible happens. On October 8, 1991, the Prosecutor General's office officially reopened the Kazinet case. 2 serious investigators from Moscow were assigned to pierce the veil of lies: Vladimir Guzhenkov and criminal prosecutor Yuri Stolyarov. What they found was a conspiracy of silence as thick and suffocating as the forest itself. Vladimir knocked on every door in Kazinet, pressing villagers for details they claimed not to possess. But one name kept surfacing from the murky depths of village gossip, whispered with the kind of fear usually reserved for demons. Vasily. Vasily was serving time for murdering his own brother, Slava, what initially appeared to be just another drunken brawl. But now, under renewed investigation, that murder looked different. Especially when Vladimir learned that Slava might have been planning to confess what really happened to the 7 boys. In prison, Vladimir chipped away at Vasily's defenses like a patient archaeologist. At first, the stories shifted and contradicted each other, but slowly, reluctantly, a confession began to emerge. Vasily wasn't just a witness to the horror at Kazinet. He was one of its architects. But even Vasily's confession didn't add up. How could he and one brother overpower 7 healthy teenagers? It was mathematically impossible, unless there were more players in this game of death. Vladimir demanded the bodies be exhumed. When forensic experts examined the remains with fresh eyes and better tools, the truth finally clawed its way to the surface. The 7 boys had not been killed by the train. They had been murdered, savagely, methodically, and with tools that matched exactly those found in railway maintenance depots. Skulls fractured with surgical precision, jaws shattered on both sides, trauma that spoke of sustained brutality. The train had merely been the final act in a horror play that had begun hours earlier. Under renewed pressure, more names surfaced from Kazinet's pool of secrets. Yuri, Vasily's other brother. Slava, now conveniently dead and unable to contradict any story. And most chilling of all, Nikolai, a senior police lieutenant who had been visiting the village that weekend. A man of authority, a man with a gun, a man who should have been protecting the innocent, not orchestrating their destruction. When confronted, Nikolai claimed he'd left Kazinet before the murders occurred. But the villagers, perhaps finally sickened by their own complicity, began to contradict him. He had been there. He had been drinking with the others. He had been part of whatever unholy gathering had decided the fate of 7 children. Through patient interrogation, another name surfaced. Pyotr, the foreman's brother. But Pyotr wouldn't be talking to anyone. He was dead, having apparently taken his own life not long after the investigation reopened. During one particularly grueling round of questioning, the local foreman finally broke. He'd had enough of the constant questions, the guilt that ate at him like acid. He agreed to tell Vladimir everything. He named names. He described the night in detail. He spoke about the drinking, the confrontation, the weapons. And then he revealed the final, revolting truth of what really happened to the 7 on that cursed August night. As the sun dipped below the dense canopy, and Kazinet settled into its familiar nighttime hush, one of the few houses near the tracks buzzed with dangerous energy. At least 3 liters of home-brewed alcohol were being passed around like communion wine at a black mass. The names around that table were a rogue's gallery of corruption, the local foreman, and his doomed brother Pyotr, Vasily and his brother Yuri, and the visiting police lieutenant Nikolai. They weren't celebrating or mourning anything. They were simply bored, and in a place like Kazinet, boredom can be a dangerous thing. As the drinks flowed and the evening wore on, they eventually ran out of alcohol. They went to the train station in search of cargo handlers, who sometimes carried contraband for barter. That night, however, there were no handlers to be found. Instead, standing by the rails in the pale moonlight, were 7 boys, all strangers to the men, all young and alive, and utterly unprepared for what was about to unfold. The men would later claim the boys were trying to sabotage the rails, a story that never held water, but served as justification for what came next. The boys had tickets for the 10:39 p.m. train. They knew the schedule. They had no reason to interfere with anything, but the men needed an excuse, any excuse. A confrontation erupted. Voices rose in the darkness. And then, with the inevitability of an avalanche, the attack began. According to confessions that would haunt courtrooms for years, it started with Lieutenant Nikolai. When one of the 7 boys tried to stand up to him, maybe defending his friends or attempting to defuse the situation, Nikolai struck him in the head with the butt of his service weapon. The blow was instantly fatal. The other 6 boys froze in horror, their young minds unable to process what they'd just witnessed. Nikolai then shouted to his companions to finish the job, to leave no witnesses. What followed was chaos of the purest kind. Tools were grabbed, railway implements now pressed into service as instruments of murder. The men descended on the remaining boys like wild animals, but worse than animals because this was murder for the sake of murder. Some tried to run into the darkness between the trees, but Nikolai still had his weapon, and he commanded them to stop with the voice of absolute authority. Those who hadn't yet been touched by death froze again, paralyzed by obedience to authority. The men continued their work until all 7 lay broken in the dirt beside the rails. Afterward, Nikolai directed the others in staging the scene. A train was due to pass soon, and they needed to ensure their crime would be buried beneath tons of steel. They moved the 7 bodies carefully across the tracks, arranging them like a final insult. Then they lined up the backpacks to help sell the story of tired, foolish boys who'd simply made a fatal mistake. When their grisly work was complete, the men scattered like roaches when the lights come on. Later, at 1:40 a.m., train number 2008 rumbled through Kazinet, obliterating the evidence beneath its wheels. By the time the Suprunenko brothers stepped off their locomotive, the killers were long gone, and the boys were well beyond any earthly salvation. The truth, as ugly and deplorable as a cancer eating away at the soul, had finally been revealed. When the case reached court in 1995, the entire country was watching. For 7 months, the trial dragged on. When the judge finally read the verdict, it took over an hour. Nikolai, who had orchestrated the slaughter, was sentenced to death, as were the foreman and brothers Vasily and Yuri. Finally, it seemed justice had been served. But evil, once unleashed, is not so easily contained. Just as the convicted men began their wait in prison cells, Russia took a political pivot. In a move to align with European human rights standards, the country began abolishing capital punishment. On May 31st, 1996, a legal protest was filed to overturn the verdicts. The Supreme Court agreed, and just like that, everything unraveled. Not only were the death sentences tossed aside, but due to legal technicalities, the previously convicted men were simply released. No retrial, no continued custody. They walked free, as if the blood on their hands was nothing more than imagination. After his release, Vasily attacked a cousin who had known everything and wasn't planning to keep quiet. Yuri was found dead from either suffocation or pneumonia, depending on which report you believe. Then came the most chilling incident. A railroad worker who had helped remove the 7 bodies from the tracks was found beneath the wheels of a train at Kazinet, allegedly from slipping and falling. The message was clear. Some stories are meant to stay buried. By the late 1990s, most people assumed the case was finally dead. They were wrong. In February 1997, the families pushed hard enough to force the Prosecutor General's office to reopen the case once more. It would take 4 more years, 3 additional exhumations, 5 expert forensic reviews, and testimony from more than 100 witnesses. And through it all, one name kept surfacing: Nikolai. Since his release, this orchestrator of child murder had become a municipal deputy. The man who'd ordered the execution of 7 children was now making decisions that affected entire communities. But in the fall of 2001, something approaching a miracle occurred. The Supreme Court issued a new verdict. Nikolai, the foreman, and Vasily were once again found guilty. The sentences were a mockery of the crime's magnitude. Nikolai and the foreman received just 10 years in maximum security colonies, less than 18 months for each young life they'd stolen. Vasily got 7 years. For the families, it wasn't justice. It was simply acknowledgement that injustice had limits. Even then, Nikolai never stopped filing appels, never stopped claiming he was the real victim. The man who'd ordered the slaughter continued to fight for his freedom, while 7 boys remained forever 15. forever silenced. Despite the loss, the lies, the retrials, and political maneuvering, the truth finally emerged and held. Not because the system worked, it had failed spectacularly, but because parents who'd lost everything refused to let the darkness have the final word. Kazinet was never the same after the murder of the Seven. The town had always known something. Its silence had been complicity, its blindness willful. What happened there is more than just an unspeakable crime. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes. Sometimes it wears a uniform and speaks with authority. Sometimes it lives next door and claims to be sleeping when the screams begin. But the horror of Kazinet isn't an isolated incident in Russia's dark history. There's another chilling case that will make your blood run cold. The Dyatlov Pass incident. 9 experienced hikers ventured into the Ural Mountains in 1959 and never returned alive. When their bodies were finally found, the scene was so bizarre that investigators couldn't even determine what killed them. Some were found half-dressed in sub-zero temperatures, fleeing their tent in terror. Others had injuries so severe, they defied explanation. One victim was missing her tongue and eyes. The tent had been cut open from the inside, as if the hikers were desperately trying to escape something. What could cause 9 experienced outdoorsmen to flee into a frozen wasteland, wearing almost nothing? The official investigation concluded they died from an unknown compelling force, but that's where the real mystery begins. If you want to dive deeper into the most chilling mysteries, click on one of the cards on your screens. Thanks for watching Unseen Casebook Vids. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more cases that will haunt your dreams. And remember, in some places, the darkness never truly leaves.